Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery Resistance and Abolition at Yale. Welcome back to our numerous good friends. We have a full seminar room this afternoon, and we have a very special guest. We're very privileged this spring to have as our in-person visiting fellow, Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick, who is a major writer in this vast field of human trafficking and modern forms of slavery. Austin is here as our visiting fellow, but also as part of our general initiative on modern slavery. I'm going to introduce Austin quickly as possible, and then move right to his talk. This is in our older, wonderful brown bag tradition of a roughly 40-minute talk, then Q&A and discussion. So we welcome your questions. Please enter them in the Q&A if you would, and not in the chat, but I think you can do it both places. Austin is university professor at the University of California at San Diego at the Kroc School of Peace Studies. He's been a fellow at the Rights Lab in Nottingham in England, which has become a major site for the study of modern slavery. He did his PhD at Notre Dame in sociology. He did an MA at the Corbell School at the University of Denver. He was an undergraduate at Middle Tennessee. He has written numerous books, essays, edited volumes. I'll name a few. He's currently working on two projects, if I understand correctly. One we will hear all about today, Bonded, the relationships slavery makes and why they matter. Another called Wicked Problems, Ethics of Action in Peace, Rights, and Justice. He's the author 2017 of the book called What Slaveholders Think. This is contemporary modern slaveholders. He's also got a book called The Good Drone, which I have not read, but I have to now, just based on that title. What, pray tell, is the good drone? Certainly not those being used by Amazon, I hope, but maybe they are. I don't know. No, okay, good. Lots of essays and op-eds in places like Al Jazeera, The Guardian, etc. Austin is a major voice in the public history and contemporary public discussion of this huge and enduring problem of human trafficking and modern slaveholding. Austin is momentarily out in San Diego, flying back tomorrow. He's on the road a lot, but we've welcomed him here already, and we look forward to doing so again. So Austin, welcome to the GLC, and we very much look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's such a kind introduction. I've been having such a wonderful time this month. Thank you, David, Michelle, Melissa, Tom, Daniel, everyone at GLC who's made me feel so welcome. I'm really excited to be talking today about this book. It's a sort of a work-in project talk, very appropriate, I think, for a brown bag. So if we were really together all in person, we'd all have our lunches out and you'd be listening and sort of staring at the ceiling and wondering if the way I'm doing it is the right way, which would be the right question to be asking. And so I'm hoping that this is taken sort of in that work in progress spirit that it's intended in. Let me tell you a little bit of how I got here. It was, we would also be in person. We'd be in person. This is in 2018. I was last at the GLC giving a talk about what slaveholders think, as David kindly mentioned. And David may not remember this, but afterward at a reception, we're having a glass of wine, and I was mentioning to him this data that hadn't made it into What Slaveholders Think, which is this sort of unusual and unused data that I had from the study, which is I didn't quite know what to do with. And he said, well, that sounds really unusual. You should do something with that. And thus, given that charge or that dispensation, I went out and I did something about it. Now here I am. That was 2018. Here we are a couple of years later, too many years later to still be working on one book, talking about the fruits of that conversation. I'm aware of the fact that I'm not sure how many historians we have here. I'm not a historian. I'm trained as a sociologist, and I will do my best to not get athwart the historians, but I want to flag that I'm no historian. It reminds me, when I was writing an earlier book, I took the first draft to the American Anthropological Association, and the discussant was John Borneman, who's now at Princeton. I think he was at Berkeley at the time. And at the end of my talk, he got up and he said, "Choi-Fitzpatrick, you can come into our temple, but you cannot trample on our idols." And I realized, I'm not an anthropologist, which of course I had said, but I want to say I'm not an anthropologist, also not a historian. So I think I say this by way of a plea for forbearance. What I want to talk about today is what happens when we listen in stereo to two sides of a story, in a particular human rights violations and a particular human right violation, bonded labor. And so I want to just take a quick step back in sort of telling you a little bit how I got to this project, which is a talk for about 3 or 4 minutes about what slaveholders think, this book that David had mentioned and was what brought me to GLC last. And it really did set up, both in terms of where the data came from and where I got the puzzle, the sort of conversation we'll be having today, and the work in progress I'll be presenting. So what do we learn when we listen to perpetrators? This was a study that it comes out of my dissertation. It was funded by the National Science Foundation and Kellogg Institute at Notre Dame. And it was comprised of semi-structured interviews and focus groups with people who are or had been held in bonded labor, people who are or had held others in bonded labor. I also spoke with community leaders, organizers, and all of this in 2 states in India, Uttar Pradesh and Karnataka, one in the north and one in the south. We can get into some of those details later if you're interested. And I was working alongside 4 human rights groups that were initiating grassroots mobilization against bonded labor. You know, we talk about contemporary slavery, and it's an open question, I think, of whether bonded labor is a persistent form of exploitation that is conceptualized by the movement as a contemporary form of slavery, but has deep roots and is not contemporary at all. It's a legacy and leftover form of exploitation. So these are grassroots efforts initiated by social movements to challenge that. And what I like about this is, I told you also, I'm not a historian, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm also not a criminologist. So I'm a little bit less interested in going into prisons or looking at court records necessarily to see what do the accused say about their lives and their actions. I'm much more interested in areas where the ground moves beneath people's feet. And in this case, bonded labor is against the law, but it doesn't violate local norms. And what I did is I asked perpetrators, how have things changed around here? And I'm not going to read these to you, but what perpetrators told me is times have changed. Masters, their words, not mine. Suffer. Servants, their words, not mine. Excel. And this is complicated and painful. And all of this led to this book, What Slaveholders Think, in which I sort of tried to argue that that perpetrators are dynamic social actors. They vary in their attitudes and opinions. Some want to be doing what they're doing. Some would rather leave it behind. They vary in their structural positions, their commitments to the status quo. Sometimes they feel trapped. I wish I didn't have to do this, but I keep having to do it because otherwise I wouldn't have the capital to continue running my business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as a social movements and human rights scholar, I think this really complicates how we think about movement targets and rights violators. But I left this sort of study really with a strong sense that I was not telling the whole story. You know this, I know this. I think this is a bit of a corrective or sort of a counterbalance in a scholarship where we in the contemporary anti-slavery, contemporary anti-trafficking scholarship and praxis spend more time thinking about survivors than we do about perpetrators, for a good reason. Hope bunch of reasons for that. We can talk about it another time. But I came away with this distinct sense that I wasn't getting the whole story, right? And what I had described to David in 2018 at that GLC conference is that I had this data I couldn't quite square with the existing literature, with my understanding of rights violations. I had these interviews with 24 individuals that represented 12 matched pairs of perpetrators and survivors. In some cases, the exploitation was still occurring when I spoke to each of the parties separately about their lives. And in other cases, the exploitation had been in the past and had been ended as a result of challenges by advocacy organizations, social movements, grassroots efforts, etc. So this has led to now the last couple of years of me wrestling with these matched pairs. I've done a couple of things with them. One, I've done sort of comparative analysis across them. And the other thing I've done, and this is the topic I'm going to be talking about today, is I've converted these interviews into narratives. I just want to stop here for a moment and just let's rest on this for a second. These are semi-structured interviews. These were conversations that started with how have things changed around here, and then sort of what tell me what happened and what happened next, sorts of Studs Terkel kind of conversations. And these interviews led to hundreds of hours, just like all of these things do, of audio that then gets translated and transcribed. But this then I converted into narrative. So I just want to just keep that in your mind, this process of storifying interview data. Should have a little asterisk in your mind about what best practices look like there. And here's what came out the other end. On the left, you can see that this is a third generation bonded laborer who inherited his father's debt at 15. These are pseudonyms here. And he told me, I wonder if he felt betrayed, he said about the person who had held him in bonded labor. And then I also spoke to Akanda, the man who exploited, held him. Verbs here are slippery. He's a third generation landlord who inherited his father's 80 acres and Swabu, the laborer, right? So what I then have is these two different stories about life, labor, sometimes love, that contradict each other in some places and overlap in others. And this is the heart of the kind of puzzle I'm trying to wrestle with in this book project. So that's the data. It's kind of where it came from and a bit of what it looks like. And I want to skip right to sort of findings and the things that I'm arguing out of this data. And then we'll pull back and look at some of the dilemmas I think that this raises. So the second big question here is, what do we get by listening in stereo? If we have, if we have two voices coming, is this a neat comparative study that I'm doing, or is this something different or something a little more? So the first thing I'm coming away with this from in terms of findings is that the traditional advocacy story we tell is flawed. Now I want to be careful about who the we is in the we tell, because it's possible that what I'm talking about is really confined to the anti-slavery and contemporary anti-trafficking, contemporary anti-slavery sort of conversation and movement at the moment. It may be that this applies a bit more generally to sort of humanitarian stories about how we can act in the world, human rights narratives, implicit and explicit, about how we can be the change we seek in this world. So I'm playing right now with scale. How far can we take this advocacy story challenge? So, for example, this paired data challenges questions about the unit of analysis. What's the unit of analysis? I feel like the conventional account tends to suggest that individuals are the unit of analysis. And most human rights scholarship focuses, in fact, on individuals or systems, where even the perpetrator literature that I'm contributed to is looking at individuals. That's the real unit of analysis. But in fact, most human rights violations are relational. So relationships are an important unit of analysis. They may even be the unit of analysis. To start thinking relationally is something I think we should begin having conversations about. And what about agency? I'm going to do a deep dive into agency in just a minute, but the conventional account suggests that rights violations are perpetrated by the powerful, who have all the agency or much of the agency, and these are perpetrated against the powerless, who have little to no agency. And looking at this data, sort of comparative and in an emergent frame, which I'll talk about in a minute, suggests that perpetrators indeed possess more power than victims. This is why they're the perpetrators. This is why there are human rights challenges against them. There's no doubt about that. But we need greater sensitivity to perceptions of agency. And this helps shed important light on both human rights theory and practice, how we conceptualize things and the actions that we actually take on the ground. Reading across these conversations and these stories challenges the conventional account about time. In most advocacy stories, certainly, and in some of the literature, human rights interventions are sort of presented as a relatively clean break with the past. There's a before and an after. There's an exploitation and there's an emancipation. There is a slavery and there's a freedom. And as every historian in the room can tell you, it's never that clean. Even if our stories, our advocacy stories are that clean, the reality rarely is. And this new account, looking at this data, suggests that rights interventions frequently produce a liminal phase, something between the old status quo and whatever's next, which is uncertain and unknown oftentimes. And this interregnum is experienced by perpetrators and by survivors, by both parties. And it's experienced with a combination of nostalgia and hope, both of which are generative to the potential for future political projects. And what about roles? The conventional account suggests that there are a simple number of mutually exclusive roles. I'm stereotyping here, but this is what advocacy sort of efforts tend to do. It's a reduction to genre: villains, victims, heroes. And of course, this sort of more nuanced approach suggests that these activist dichotomies are, I say here, rarely useful, but they may be useful for mobilizing people to give money or to join campaigns. But roles are complicated and are self-defined. I interviewed villains who felt they were the victims, or they also, in some cases, thought they were the heroes. It's also possible that victims themselves feel like they are the heroes, or in some cases that victims go on in life to re-perpetrate. I'm sorry, not re-perpetrate, but to actually perpetrate the same things that they've experienced onto others. So we can see, I mean, it's all in quotes here, victims evolving into villains. Are these the right sorts of frames for how we think about people? And this is a challenge in particular for the advocacy world. And what about action? The conventional account suggests that the solutions to rights violations are to initiate radical breaks of the past, like police raids, NGO rescues, courtroom showdowns, etc. But reading across this data suggests that in many cases, it's helpful to include both parties and social change strategies and to focus on structural forces and factors. This would not be surprising to anyone listening from the international development community, but it might be a note for the human rights advocacy world. So these are the 5 sort of major thumbnail sketches of the takeaways from this project of listening in stereo to both parties. Now, I'm doing this very sort of telegraphically, thumbnail sketch, it's a rapid overview, but let's do a quick sort of deeper dive into just 2 of these things, agency and time. So around agency, perceptions matter. My daughter often says, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. I think she's right. And I think this plays out in I've seen this play out in the data that I've got in this book. Perceptions matter. If a perpetrator thinks they're going to try to continue perpetrating, they will continue trying. Whether they ultimately succeed is a different matter. And the second is that perceptions are often relative to others. These perceptions are not just whether one thinks one can, but whether or not one thinks one can in the context. And this affects survivors and perpetrators alike, and especially in relation to a clear referent category where the other is the other half of a dyad in an exploitative relationship. Now, sources of power vary between parties. And so there are many cases in which survivors and perpetrators vary in their cultural, economic, or political sources of power. There are many cases in which the cultural power had been in the hands of the perpetrator, who could say, based on a higher caste status in rural India, "Don't you know who I am?" That works so long as the other party doesn't look at you and say yes, and it doesn't matter anymore because the people have united together with a local advocacy group, grassroots group, or something like that. The emphasis is here on the changing nature of the source of power. You can say, "Don't you know who I am?" And then if the other person says no and I don't care, then you can hire a lawyer, but you can only hire a lawyer if you have economic capital. And so sources of power, economic power, social power, and political power vary between parties, but they also vary within parties over time. And this has led a really clever colleague of mine, Amelia Watkins-Smith, at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, where I've spent the last 4 years as a concurrent associate professor of modern slavery, but we have argued in a new article that just came out last year, the agency is a continuum rather than a dichotomy or a binary. There isn't this jump from no power to power or agency-less to agency fullness. Instead, dyads in both parties, for example, reported feeling powerless when we analyzed at the level of the relationship. It's easy to do a comparative analysis and say who's got more power, but if we ask who feels powerful, in some cases, both parties felt powerless. Now, again, I hasten to add, this does not mean that a once powerful person who no longer feels powerful is less powerful. That's not my point. I'm reminded of the aphorism that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. This is something that resonates, I think, worldwide as people accustomed to power and privilege have all of a sudden feel as if the ground has been pulled beneath their feet because they're being treated like everybody else in some cases. So again, I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that the powerful are powerless. We're talking about perceptions here, but perceptions matter, this original point. Briefly here also on time, there's this sense, a prevalent sense of flux that in interview after interview reminded me of JNU sociologist Dipankar Gupta said, the village, this place that was lionized by Gandhi as the source and the soul of Indian culture. The village is no longer a place where futures can be planned. There's this sense of flux at the national level, at the political level, at the economic level, the geostrategic level that permeated these conversations and trickled down to a sense that villages were not a place where the future could be planned. Cities are a place where futures can be pursued, perhaps not planned, but pursued, but not the village. There's a sort of this in-between feeling that it rises above any one particular aspect of one's life. It also applies in a sense of feeling between eras. Are we in the old era of the grandfather? If we remember those two quotes I put up earlier, are we in the era of the grandfather, or are we in some future era where only individuals and their cell phones and their desire for clothes and money, a concern expressed by landlords in my interviews, prevails? So there's this moment where we're between roles and conditions, especially related to debt. I spoke to landlords who had taken out collateral, put up their farms as collateral in order to borrow money from banks, and then used the money to buy grain, and then bonded laborers who took grain as payment, as collateral against their labor. And that you can see a sort of like a debt chain that extends all the way through, through both parties and terminates in some cases in banks or farmer lending institutions. So we've got people who aren't sure what the future is going to look like. And it's not just the survivor who has initially been part of a grassroots mobilization and entered this new space of possible emancipation, but it's also the landlord who's entered the space in which it's not clear who has what role, how are we supposed to relate, and even more importantly, what's next for our community. And this has led to both hope for and nostalgia for the past. So nostalgia for the past and hope for the future, sorry. And both of these in some ways are fulcrum or for political action. You can think of the past as animating conservative mobilization, for example, or hope for the future, animating additional human rights struggles. And so where we are in time in these stories is thickened when we listen to both parties in stereo, as I'm sort of pointing it here. The takeaway from both this agency and time sort of little deep dive is a sense of liminality. This is I love this idea. It comes from this idea of the marge, which is this sort of no man's land between city-states in medieval Europe, the space that didn't really belong to anyone. It was between places. And Van Gennep, a sort of Belgian anthropologist, has extended this to also think and talk about time. So we have these liminal spaces temporally. It's this intermezzo moment between eras. Relationally, it's this liminal zone between people as their roles and relationships are in flux. And then sort of experientially, there's this sort of blank space, this no man's land, underdetermined environment between exploitation and freedom. This is the story, of course, of emancipation in the United States. There wasn't this binary snap. There is incredible efforts on both sides to essentially win a long 100-year, not even terminating in 1965 struggle for what freedom, fully fledged freedom, would actually look like. And so I feel in some ways I'm sort of echolocating at the very earliest moments when that dilemma is starting to be wrestled with. And I'm conceptualizing this in a lot of ways in terms of liminality, this moment and time in between people and space and time. Okay, so those are some findings, a deep dive into some findings. Now, let me tell you about some dilemmas. I told you this might be this is a bit of a workshop, a bit workshop. So this is will hopefully set us up for some of the Q&A. Here are some of the dilemmas that I've already got a question in the Q&A. I love that. Here we are with some of the dilemmas that I'm facing. What to call any of this? Are these narratives? Are these testimonies? I started out thinking of them as narratives. There is a small and growing slave narrative sort of literature, contemporary slave narrative literature from my colleague Laura Murphy, who's written a book called The New Slave Narrative. Are these narratives? And if so, what do we call the perpetrators' voices? The perpetrators don't need narratives. In the American context, slave owners wrote Southern history and wrote Southern laws and were Southern culture in terms of letters and institutions. And so what then is the unit of analysis? Is it interview data? Is it narratives? Is it testimony? What do we actually call this stuff, right? And perhaps then we start to think about this as a story. Now, remember I told you that I've taken these interviews and turned them into narratives, interview data into narratives. So have I storified these things? What do we start looking for? Do we look for a shared metaphor? I have a chapter that is actually in search of shared metaphors, following the work of important folks like Lakoff and Johnson who worked on metaphor. Can we look for shared metaphors? And then what's the means of analysis? I mentioned earlier that Amelia and I did this study in Human Rights Quarterly last year. That was a comparative analysis. We said, what do they say? What do they say? Where's the gap? Can we measure the gap? We asked questions like that. But is there some sort of like emergent knowledge that comes out of reading these things together? And that's a puzzle I'm still wrestling with right now. And this is why it has a question mark on it, right? How do we actually understand and interpret this? And then finally, how do we even present them? And these are all sort of seem a bit methodological, but they're actually also tied in with, I think, a kind of like epistemological approach or theory of or philosophy of knowledge. How do we even present these things? Now I'm about to talk about graphic design, but I think even that is tied to these broader and more nuanced questions about whose voices matter and how we understand them. So here's now I'm going to talk about actually this is how I'm trying to play with think about playing with the layout for the book. So here's one way to do it. Got the survivor on one side and the perpetrator on the other, a sort of recto verso approach, and let these just stand there. All right. But the more I've been thinking about this, the more I think about the fact that there is a third party in this conversation, and it is the Western gaze. It is the intellectual engagement. The fact that these people are being talked to by somebody, which is me, and it seems putting just these voices on the page doesn't give as much credit, or doesn't add enough space for nuance. Started thinking about maybe I put these on the left and the right. Maybe I interweave them. I don't put the whole thing here. I interweave them thematically, and you sort of read through, ricocheting through these stories. Or maybe we just are a little bit more honest about what's happening here, and survivors on one side, the perpetrators on the other, and somehow I write in the gutter. If you imagine this as a book, I write in the center, somehow trying to pull lessons out or do some kind of additional analysis in. I don't even like that spatially, to be honest. Do I belong in the center? No, I don't think I am in the center. I don't think that's where knowledge sits. So this is where I'm currently This is my most recent attempt to do this. What if I organize the page like this? You have the survivor's voice here in a snippet, perpetrator's voice here in a snippet. We lead with a little bit of context, and then the narrator, that's me, steps in and says, where were we? You can read this text here perhaps on your screen. We are sitting under a large tamarind tree at a bend in the pathway in the middle of land, terraced as far as the eye can see. And then I have, I've got all of this written up. And then what we do is we then start to unpack, well, what does it matter that the land is terraced? And what does it mean when Putami here says, my village taught me how to write my name? What do these things mean? And what do we, and how do we start to think about them? And so I'm also then a sort of a subtext as I write through these voices. You see how what I'm playing with at every step of the way here is moving away from a simple comparative analysis and trying to move, even in the presentation on the page, towards something that toward an approach that allows more nuance to come out and allows the reader to engage in a way that doesn't just follow me wherever I want to take them by, for example, showing just a perpetrator and a survivor or interlacing them. So this is an open question I have. I have sort of a dilemma right now. Here's the punchline though, and we'll wrap here. I think we're good on time. I'm going to wrap here and we'll open it up for a Q&A. The title of this talk is The Relationships Contemporary Slavery Makes and Why They Matter. And my argument here is that the relationships that bonded labor makes, and maybe this book should better be called Bonded Labor as opposed to Contemporary Slavery, is something we can also talk about in the Q&A. The relationships that bonded labor makes should matter to the contemporary anti-slavery movement. I've mentioned some of the sort of five main sort of stories that come out of the contemporary anti-slavery movement. But I also think that the way I'm doing this, I hope, is an invitation to some methodological innovation, just making some progress in how we think about what some of my colleagues are writing about as relational sociology. What happens if we take Georg Zimmel's idea that the basic unit of social analysis is the dyad rather than the individual seriously, methodologically? We have that sort of writing at the philosophical level, but how that gets operationalized as methodology is something that I think is an open question for my colleagues in sociology and in social theory. The next thing I hope it does is present an opportunity for some novel empirical findings. I was bolstered by a conversation in 2018 with David, who said, I don't think there is a lot of data out there like this. Now, there's a little bit in the literature on intimate partner violence. Social psychologists are starting to ask both parties in an intimate partner violence scenario, what happened? And it turns out that the stories vary, and they vary in theoretically and methodologically important ways. So no doubt that two different parties to a conflict tell different stories, but it turns out there's interesting patterns, and it matters in something more than just a sort of a basic comparative approach to be talking to both parties. And then finally, and it's perhaps at its most ambitious, I really think that this idea about victims, heroes, and villains is not just an anti-contemporary slavery campaign kind of shortcut. I think it's perhaps a shortcut that cuts all the way to the root of the last 200 years of human rights advocacy work and humanitarian efforts. I'm not the first to say this, but I think that some of the arguments here might scale well beyond the case. And so I look forward to conversations that help me better articulate, learn whether or not that's true, and then better articulate that argument if it is. That's it for me. I'm really excited to open it up to conversations, questions, and this is going to be mediated by David. So I'm going to mute myself and express my deepest appreciation to you all. Thank you for listening.
Well, Austin, thank you. My goodness, it's a lot to chew on in such a short time. We do have one big question already, but I'm going to start with a question just to get you so you can unmute. Please send in your questions in the Q&A, we hope. First of all, this urge, this quest you have to get beyond the binary, to get beyond good and evil, pure right and wrong. Not that you're avoiding what's right in this world and what's wrong in a world of human rights, but this kind of, which, by the way, I admire. Anything that gets us human beings out of our utter certainty is a good thing. But did you did you arrive at this quest to look at the dyad and not individuals before you did this kind of research, all these interviews, or did the interviews lead you there? Was this a big hunch you gained from other work, from other colleagues, from other experiences? Or did this just hit you between the eyes that this is a world of terrible complexity when a system is being ended or ended in some way? Or I'm wondering how this came about and what came first.
That's a great question. I think there's probably two answers to it. One is the actual research agenda, methodological sort of puzzle. And I did not go into the field expecting to get this data. And I did not come out, maybe if I'd been clever, this is the book I would have written first, and then maybe done a perpetrator's book later, perhaps. But I did not go into the field with this. I really did. The story I told is actually the order of play. Is I came out and when I realized in the field that it was possible to speak to matched pairs, I jumped at the chance. So in the field, I saw that was a possibility, but I didn't know where that fit. I'd never read the literature on that. I didn't think, oh, this is going to be. I just thought it was there. I was, and I can I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to speak to the folks I spoke to under the conditions I was able to. So in some of these cases, the exploitation was ongoing, and in some it was in the past. And so, I'm dealing in some shorthand here as I give a talk, but some of these were current and or past perpetrators of rights violations, and current and or past. So this survivor language, which I'm using throughout, is a term of art because in fact, some were actually being victimized in the process, or in the moment that I was, or in the window of time that I was there. So I came out with this sense that I had been able to get some interviews that were really unprecedented. But I didn't know how unprecedented, and I hadn't done a literature review, and I wasn't at the other end of me saying like, here's something I want to go and find out. I wasn't go out with a sociologist with like hypotheses, so I didn't go out with this hunch. But and this is the second answer to your question, David, is that when I got it, I realized, oh, this is something I've been deeply curious about for a long, long time. And I think that it really, in some ways, and I don't want to, and this maybe anticipates some of Zoe's question in the Q&A, but I feel like this is a familiar moment to all of us where we think other people think we have power, but we don't think we have power, right? Talk to anybody who runs an institution, and that's exactly how they feel. I'm not trying to say that if we, this data applies to, how we think about institutional life and institutional sociology, but this dilemma really is pervasive. And as soon as I started really getting into this data and thinking about it, I started seeing patterns in other places. The challenge for me, though, is that I don't know who the scholarly fellow travelers are, who else is writing in this vein. And so perhaps to wrap up the answer, perhaps if I had wanted this as a hypothesis to begin with, generated by the literature, I never would have got there. Because I don't think it's a hypothesis in the literature. I'm a sociologist. It's actually not a question. And so I'm hoping to be wrong. And somebody says, oh, you've missed the whole vein of scholarship and this whole debate in the 70s. I can't wait for somebody to prove, to show that to me, because then I'll learn from it and contribute to that conversation. But that was the order of play.
Well, it sounds like you did this research in the old-fashioned proper order. You let the data lead you, rather than already knowing ahead of time. You have begun to answer Zoe Louise's question, but would you reflect on that maybe a little more? She wants to know this approach of complicating the binary of good and bad and so on, the victim and the perpetrator. Do you think it applies to other fields, other kinds of experiences? What are broader implications of this, other than to make human beings a little more, into humility?
So this is a great question. Thank you, Zoe. Good to see you. I think that there's two answers here. I think two questions here and two answers. The first is that I hope, and this is how I ended that last slide, I hope that there is, well, I don't hope, I suspect and wish it wasn't the case, that this applies more broadly than in this particular case. Because I think that this is ever going all the way back to efforts to mobilize public outrage over slavery 150, 200 years ago in the sort of in the transatlantic slave trade era, and that era of mobilization. Galvanization and political action requires galvanization requires some sort of movement off of stasis, and that usually requires a shock, that usually requires some sort of new information, that era of the movement innovated lantern shows. As soon as photography came out, really just leaned heavily into that technological space in order to more quickly and specifically tell stories that moved hearts and minds in order to move the needle politically. That sort of animating effort, I think, is present across social movements, certainly in democracies over the last 200 years, and as part of the social movement repertoire that we all sort of would adopt. If you and I said, let's go make some change and do it in a slightly disruptive, unconventional way, that's what we choose.
In the media, shock them in the media.
So I think that this is terribly widespread and effective. Yeah. And so what I don't want to be doing is coming after advocacy efforts and saying, we don't want you to be doing the thing that works. And so I think, Zoe, just to finish answer your question, I think that this happens in a lot of places. And the second question is, have I done it? Have I applied this elsewhere? I haven't. And so I'd welcome any conversations with folks who have done this work elsewhere, see other opportunities to apply the lesson.
Yeah, there's the second question that is really kind of in the same vein about how this applies to problems in the world beyond chattel slavery. I mean, there's so many other kinds of issues on this planet, as our questioner says, that isn't just a person owns a person. I mean, again, I do think your analysis here applies beyond this. But we don't live in an age, do we, Austin, of sympathy for the slaveholder?
We do not live in an age of sympathy for the slaveholders. And I want to say one beat here, and this is inspired by Adriana's question, which is the methodology that I had confined so far to discussing chattel slavery. And I'll just stop right there and emphasize something I think I underemphasized earlier, and I apologize. I'm looking at bonded labor in India, which is something that is socially accepted. People do not, in some cases, have a handful of cases where there's actually like a chit or a memorandum or a sort of loaned ledger or document, but these are not legally binding relationships. This form of exploitation has been illegal in India for a long, long time, since 1976, and is culturally sanctioned in some cases, but is not officially approved or legally sort of eligible.
This is what I mentioned, hundreds of years, right? I mean,
thousands. This has been happening for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years regionally. And so this is why I emphasized earlier, I'm not a criminologist, and I'm not interested in when these things slip over into this rational decision by a perpetrator to perpetrate a crime, and this knowledge by an individual who's been victimized that they're the victim of a crime. That pairing is a different set of dilemmas and puzzles, very important, but not the ones I'm looking at. So there's not ownership here. This doesn't apply to chattel slavery. And maybe the question is for David of whether or not there is this kind of data around in the chattel slavery sort of era, where we hear from Y and Auld and from Douglas, where we have this, we can hear from both. I don't know, but I think that this is something we're only now starting to ask in this way. I'm not sure though.
Well, you immediately took me there. I don't want to answer at any length here, but we have enormous study now of, at least in the American context, of what was known as pro-slavery ideology, pro-slavery defenses. There were volumes and volumes and volumes of writings that defended slavery, and in a sense, they had enormous agency in being the voices of the defense of slavery in power of all kinds. There's no question about that. And yet, I would posit that, especially now in this, let's say the past decade or so, it's not a popular thing anymore to want to grow up and study pro-slavery ideology. It had a stage, and great distinguished historians such as Drew Faust made part of her career studying that, which was extremely valuable because it got us down on the ground in terms of what these people thought. Michael O'Brien, a great scholar at the University of Cambridge, wrote 2 huge volumes on, well, on Southern thought, but especially pro-slavery ideology. This was a search like your study for the sheer complexity of the minds of the planter class, of the slaveholding class, and so on. So we have a great scholarship on that. But you know, one interesting thing here is, and you really said it, the legal world doesn't like dyads. The legal world wants a right and wrong. That's what the law is supposed to, that's what a courtroom does. So you're not going to end up in a courtroom with this. This is not the lawyers at work. This is sociologists with very carefully constructed questions based on the data, looking for complexity. So, I mean, there are many different approaches to human rights. This one perhaps not as popular as the more legal approach. And let's just sue the bastards and put them in jail, right?
This is.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Joe, just really quick, I was going to say this goes back to Zoe's question. I think that if there is another place to look at this, it's where there is actually data. And so part of the answer to Zoe's question, which is, have I looked at this in other places? The short answer is no, and the longer answer is data is a huge obstacle. This is not an area where there's extant data, to the best of my knowledge. So I think the best place where it could possibly be done is historically, and to go back and to take some of those recapturings and reimaginations of pro-slavery defenses and thought, and then put them somehow into conversation with their competitors, which is implicitly what's happening in that literature, but we don't actually have this kind of like dyadic way of framing it. And it might not be helpful historically, but to Zoe's point, I think that the one place there is data is in discovery in legal cases. And so there is actually when you go into discovery, then that generates a body of knowledge that comes and self-reporting that comes from 2 sides. You've already heard me say that's not quite so bullish on that, because I'm interested in culture and the sort of social psychological side of things. So if you're lawyered up and then you go into discovery, that discounts a little bit how I think of that as a narrative or a testimony, or quite a bit actually. But
well, that makes me want to ask you, Austin, how much of what you're finding would you argue then is Indian? How much this is a culturally Indian story that may or may not apply in West Africa or in Eastern Europe or somewhere else?
I'm doing a small dance. I love this question, and it allows us to touch on Nisha's question as well in the Q&A. Nisha says, so you're talking about Uttar Pradesh, from India. How can you go through this whole talk? They don't say it quite this strongly. How can you go through this whole talk and never talk about caste? Wonderful question. Wonderful question. So caste considerations permeated all of these conversations and are an important part of this analysis. And so I think that I went through this talk telegraphically and should have telegraphed that. So that's a great observation by Nisha that I appreciate. The answer though, and this gets to your question, David, I conceptualize caste as a very important and long-standing in the Indian context ideology about what people owe each other that helps people to organize their lives in lots and lots of ways. Just like the West has racism and other, and different like sort of ideology, sort of spectrum locations have their own deep metaphors for who we are and what we owe each other, etc. So I think that, so what I'm trying to do is split the difference between a real attention to the particular case that does justice to how unique the caste system is, but leverages it in a way that allows us to ask bigger and more comparative questions about the things, the default assumptions I have when I look out at social change in the world and I say, well, and I grumble like an old white dude. Okay, that's if I'm somehow able to write a book that gets cast just right, but doesn't have me in the crosshairs, then I don't think I've done my job right as somebody who's trying to peel underneath to these, what did I say? Perceptions matter. Their agents, people feel like they don't have agency when they really do. That is a unique an observation I've made through close attention to a caste ensconced set of relationships. But I'm really hoping that some of those implications travel farther than that case. And so, Nisha, it's a really great, I don't know if you meant it as a corrective, but it's taken as that very appropriately. But that's the answer for what I should have probably said better in the talk.
Thank you. We have a question here from Martin Klein, whom I'm assuming is Martin Klein, who's a very distinguished historian of African slavery and slave trade. And Martin asks, and by the way, who I'm sure would welcome you into our temple. He asks, is your work on contemporary slavery relevant for the understanding of traditional slavery? If in African slave studies, students of post-slavery differentiated from contemporary slavery, he says he's not so sure. I guess he's asking you there to try to think comparatively between historical forms of slavery, in this case in Africa, and what is now called contemporary human trafficking through this lens you've created.
I don't think I have neither a smart answer nor a satisfactory answer to this, I'm afraid. I feel like this is an area, and this is now just vamping, but that's my real answer. But I feel like this is a really challenging area where we continue to have like tough conversations. And I think this is why I came in saying I'm not a historian, but I want to emphasize that as a social movement scholar, I think the social movement aspect of this has derived incredible a sense of legitimacy and place, history, and purpose from its linking of itself as a movement to a 200-year-old tradition.
Yeah,
and
I agree with you on that. The links between, well, even much older than 200, to the British anti-slavery crusade and its many forms and methods, the American anti-slavery crusade, the modern anti-slavery movement such as it is, could learn even more from that if they would just stop now and then and do a little more history. But
I think I'm wrestling in the book a little bit with whether or not some of like all the lessons from Wilberforce got learned and none of the lessons from Haiti, for example. I mean, there's also a question of like what forms of change do we capitalize on? And I think the contemporary movement has really rewarded the liberal and institutional sorts of approaches as opposed to the more radical and institution challenging sets of approaches. And I think better attention to that history would expand the sort of protest repertoire and movement for action in the movement. But my unsatisfactory answer is, as a movement scholar, I think it has been incredibly powerful for the movement. Whether or not it gets the history right, I leave to historians.
We have a very interesting question from Ann Hunter, who is essentially asking or saying that it is not hard to understand the sense of powerlessness among the bonded laborers. But could you say more about why the owners, perpetrators, whatever we want to call them, feel powerlessness? What's that powerlessness about that you have uncovered among the perpetrators?
That's a great question, Ann. Thank you. The first just quick tweak is I'm referring to these folks as slave holders, which will make some of you uncomfortable. Perhaps they should be referred to, but no. So what Ann has here is owner. And I just want to emphasize that ownership is not a part of this framing. And so that's just a little nuance there that
people are bonded to them.
People are bonded to them, unable to leave, but the relationship is deeply economic and relational, socially enforced rather than being legally enforceable in a court of law. And so the courts are out, threats to violence are in. And so just really quickly, and to answer your question, one of the fastest answer to your question is around a slide earlier where I had mentioned changing natures of power. And so, for example, in the old days, and the old days might be 5-10 years ago, it might be just before human rights intervention, and it might be like in my father's era. So people talk about the old days as a very capacious sort of temporal framing, right? Big concept. But what folks said is, in the old times, all we had to do was tell them to come, and they had to come. And they had to come because they had no other access to work. They had no ability to get to a city, and they had no other access to food, and they had to come. But now there is a good road with a fast bus, and they have a phone, and they know what labor prices are, and then they ask us for that wage.
So they're dealing with modernity on steroids. They're
dealing with modernity on steroids.
Wow.
And so the fact is that and just as a quick example, the Indian government has put into place a wage law that's, it's about now been 10, 15 years, a wage law that says everybody has to get paid the minimum wage. All of my human rights colleagues are only concerned about, that's ungenerous, I shouldn't say that. The human rights campaigners are worried, are people actually getting that wage? Yeah. But what I noticed is that just knowing what the wage was created a demand for a wage of anything, as opposed to forgiveness of an old loan inherited by a grandfather. Yeah. So just to answer question, the sense of the ground moving from beneath one's feet could be as simple as having your own land in hock to a bank. And then when a laborer says, I now need X amount of rupees to be paid, you can't pay them. One feels stuck between a rock and a hard place. And then this leads to, them having to make other decisions. That was what the slaveholders book is about. What do they do next? What's the range of motion? If you thought you were powerful, and it turns out you still are, but not in the way you thought you were. And what I argue in that book and what slaveholders think is there is a reassessment process similar to what happened during Reconstruction and the development of Jim Crow. There's just this we got to quickly think on our feet. What do we have? Well, we don't have laws, but maybe we have new laws, right? We don't have a support from the government. Maybe we support a new political party. And so there's this sort of scramble. So anyway, I'm taking this, I'm belaboring this when we're short on time, but the answer to Ann's question is that these macro changes, this sort of globalization on steroids, plus local advocacy efforts that give people the feeling that the people united will never be defeated, and then they make a demand, leaves many of these perpetrators feeling like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And is there evidence that they're considering new forms of coercion that they haven't used before, or?
So
I'm thinking of historical parallels here.
The short answer is, there's two short answers to this with my eye on the clock. The first is that some will default to the old approach, which was to threaten violence. And if the threat of violence doesn't work, actually to apply violence. The challenge is if the local organization that's doing this mobilization has a decent lawyer, then that lawyer might be better than the person who's going to pay the thugs to do the beating up's lawyer. And then you're all of a sudden have to think, you have to think about legal context. You can't just do the thing one might have done before, which is to threaten or actually act on like low level, beating people up style violence. And so this leads to, and this is the thing I track, this leads to false steps where an earlier sense of entitlement and power led to a rubber meets the road reality that, okay, that didn't work. And now I have a second charge leveled against me in court. And my cousin, who's the lawyer, won't represent me because the political winds aren't blowing in that direction. And all of a sudden, that sort of cultural capital or relational capital and the social capital in the form of a cousin who's a lawyer, all of a sudden drops off of one's balance sheet or ledger as deployable in a struggle with newly mobilized workers who are now demanding, in some cases, wages.
And is there evidence that the economic stability and structure and so on in a region, in certain regions, is at stake now in this new, whatever you want to call it, new regime of modernity where these workers have options and the so-called slaveholders don't? I mean, is there real economic stakes to this that the country has to think about? Or
I think there's two quick questions to that. This is not at the economics level. Well, so at the economics level, I think that there's a challenge India has around what percentage of its people are living in rural communities and farming. And India's always had a complicated relationship with neoliberal style globalization and where it wants to fit in, and whether or not it wants to have a sort of food independence, and whether importing food is or is not a good thing, and that's interlaced with labor, just sort of labor policy. How many people, if people aren't on their farms, then where are they? And with with the number of people that both China and India have respectively, that's a real you get 1% on the move, and that's a real question. But in the lived experience of these folks, the answer is yes. They feel like a way of life. Again, this idea that India's sort of heart is in the village. This idea of Gandhi's, that it's a large country, large and largely inhabited country that has its heart and soul in the village, is no longer something that seems true to farmers who are intergenerational. I'm a huge air quotes here, custodians of the earth, custodians of the community, the feeders of the community. This is a self-conception, delusional.
Children of the earth and all that.
So they see a world in decline, not just for themselves and their children, but for a kind of agrarian way of life that has sustained India for in some cases millennia.
Well, before we get off though, I want to say, and you can comment if you want, but there's so many things in this talk and in your work that I find so fascinating that cross out of this field. But in particular, to end on, it is your desire to confront melodrama. I'm serious, there's the world is just too full of melodrama, let's face it. Villains and heroes and nice resolutions and so on. Of course we want that, but that's not the way the world works. There are still victims and there are still terrible perpetrators, God knows. But, God bless you for wanting to seek complexity.
This reminds me of the Wordsworth, life is too much with us, coming and going, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. I'm with you. I feel like it's this constant, and I'm not an anti-technology person, but this, just to take your melodrama thing, we have found the way to crystallize this. And to crystallize into its most essential, emoji-fiable, single swipe inspiring-able sort of unit. And so, and I'm not against the movements that are at the receiving end of that swipe. It's just that if our political sort of advocacy efforts are matched in any way onto our like political philosophies and ways of seeing the world, then we're doing ourselves and our neighbors a disservice, because I'm the perpetrator class. I have a gas burning vehicle just outside my place here, right? It's me. I'm talking about me. So I'm with you on that. I want to sort of hold place for the activists who are doing the good work, but ask new questions about who we are in the midst of all that.
Well, God bless you for fessing up on your carbon footprint. But my goodness, folks out there, as probably everybody knows, this is why we have scholars. This is why we do this work, to make people think beyond where they're comfortable. And Austin, this has been a great talk. And I know you're going to be back here in the next day or two, and we'll have many more chances to discuss all of this. Thank you to everybody for coming today and sticking around, and for the good questions. And I just want to say quickly what Michelle has been saying in the chat. We have two big events next week that we're sponsoring. One is on the 20th, a major symposium on science and the residues of slavery here at Yale, leading up to the eugenics movement, which was headquartered here in the 1920s. It'll be primarily conducted by history of science students. And then on the 21st, a special lecture by Vincent Brown, marvelous historian and author of the book Tacky's Revolt, will be speaking on that at the history department, sponsored by the GLC and the history department. So again, thank you to everybody for coming. And Austin, thank you. And see you back here tomorrow or Friday.